Today, I'll be walking you through how companies enter into contracts, focusing on how they do so directly and indirectly. First, we need to ask whether the contract was entered into directly by the company. This would be the case if the company executed the contract itself, for example, through the signatures of two directors, a director and a company secretary, or a sole director if the director is the secretary or no secretary exists. If not, the contract was entered into indirectly, meaning the company acted through an agent. There are three main ways this can happen. The first is actual express authority. As the name suggests, this is where the company has clearly and explicitly authorised the agent to act on its behalf. For example, Johnny may be given actual express authority through a provision in the Corporations Act, the company's constitution, or a board resolution. However, if the authority comes from a board resolution, it's important to ensure that the resolution was validly passed. If it wasn't, then Johnny won't have actual express authority. But don't worry, there are still two other types of authority to consider. Next, we have implied authority. This arises where the company's conduct, acquiescence, surrounding circumstances, or nature of the position result in an inference that the agent has authority to enter into a contract. Generally, there are two key factors to consider here. The first is the usual scope of authority, which focuses on the agent's position within the company. For example, if Johnny is appointed as the managing director, even without explicit permission to enter into contracts, we can infer he has that authority. This is because it is customary for someone in that role to make operational and commercial decisions on behalf of the company. However, this doesn't mean that every person in a senior-sounding role automatically has implied authority, especially where the transaction is unusual or suspicious. For instance, imagine Johnny is a secretary at a small sock company, but he enters into a $40 million deal with Sony to supply all the socks for its films. That's unlikely to fall within his usual scope of authority, because someone in that role wouldn't ordinarily be empowered to make decisions of that magnitude. The second factor is the prior dealings of the agent. If Johnny is a secretary but has consistently entered into large deals, say $20 million contracts, with the company's knowledge and acceptance, then it becomes much more likely that he has implied authority. This is because there is a clear pattern of behaviour that the company has allowed, which supports the inference that he is authorised to act in that way. Finally, we have ostensible authority. Here, the focus isn't on what the company internally authorised, but on the representation made to a third party, that the agent has authority to act on the company's behalf. In Freeman and Lockyer versus Buckhurst Park Properties, Diplock set out 4 key requirements for ostensible authority. First, there must be a representation made by the company, through words or conduct, that the agent has authority to enter into the contract. Second, the person making that representation must have actual authority to manage the company. So, for example, if Johnny appears to have authority because of something Lizzie said or did, we need to ensure that Lizzie herself holds a position, like managing director, where making that representation is within the scope of her role. Third, the third party must rely on that representation, meaning they entered into the contract because they believed the agent had authority. Finally, it must be reasonable for the third party to rely on that representation. Linking back to implied authority, if Johnny is a secretary entering into a multi-million-dollar deal, it's unlikely to be reasonable for an outsider to assume he has the authority to do so. So, when analysing any issue about entering into a contract, always start by asking who acted, the company, an agent, and what authority did they have? That will tell you whether the company is truly bound.